morning, men. And welcome to Man in the Mirror, Men's Bible Study, where we always have room for one more guy. So let's go ahead and do a shout-out this morning. I'm excited to do this particular shout-out. It's to a group in Western New York at the Webster Assembly of God Church. The name of the group is Rise and Shine, and I'm excited because Will Fox, Jr. is the leader of this group, an old friend of our ministry, Man in the Mirror. They meet on Saturdays at 7 o'clock. They do use the Bible study online, and then they open it up to the community, other churches. And so I wonder if you would join me in giving a very warm welcome to the men of Rise and Shine. 1, 2, 3, hoorah! Thank you, guys. We're so glad to have you with us. By the way, how many of you guys come to the Bible study just because you get to say hoorah? His name was Todd Beamer. He was in a small group of guys that met on Friday mornings doing the 7 seasons for the Man in the Mirror book. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Todd got on a routine flight from Newark, New Jersey, out to San Francisco. He's in the software business. And before long, it became clear in the cabin that something had gone terribly amiss in the cockpit. 3 hijackers had burst into the cockpit and taken control of the plane. Several cell phone calls that were made, or on-flight calls that were made to the ground, confirmed that the World Trade Center had already been under attack by 2 planes. The reason for the timing is that this plane had been held up for 42 minutes on the tarmac, and so it had taken off late, and it was behind schedule for the terrorism. So Todd sprung into action. He became the leader of a small band of people on the plane who decided when they realized that their plane was going to be part of a terrorist plot, we're not going to let that happen. Todd was able to get through to an operator. The FBI were listening in, and he unveiled the plan that they were going to storm the cockpit and fly the plane into the ground rather than it be allowed to strike a target in Washington, D.C., which is where the plane was at that point headed. And so Todd recited the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm with the telephone operator, and then he said, "Well, let's do it. Are you ready? Let's roll." And those were the last words that were ever heard from Todd Beamer. A dozen or so passengers, led by Todd, stormed the cockpit, burst into the cockpit, and began to wrestle control of the plane. And somewhere in a field in rural Pennsylvania, 20 minutes out from Washington, D.C., where the hypothesized targets were either the White House or the Capitol building, Todd Beamer and his cohorts forced this plane to fly into the ground at 580 miles per hour. Let's roll. Let's roll. Well, it's interesting because a lot of people feel like our culture has been hijacked. And in fact, most recent reports show that 2/3 of all Americans feel like our nation is headed in the wrong direction. And wouldn't you like to be a Todd Beamer to our culture? Wouldn't you like to be a person who could keep our nation from being hijacked? But if you're like most of us, you feel impotent to do anything about that. What could you do? You're just one person. And so this morning, I want to have us take a look at a story about Jesus in which he begins to explain to the disciples how they could actually make a difference in the world. He's been building into their lives. Certainly, if we feel like our nation is in trouble, think about how the disciples must have felt. Their world was closing in on them. Their leader was hated. He was being sought by the authorities. They wanted to kill him. They ended up going into this upper room, which is basically nothing more than an off-book safe house. And so we're going to look at this story this morning as Jesus begins to lay out his plan for how to take back the world. Total global conquest. That was his mission. So in John chapters 13 through 17, Jesus lays out this plan for total global conquest. You know the story of how we got to the upper room. Jesus sent out a couple of disciples to follow a man carrying a pitcher of water, and then to ask the owner of the house, or tell the owner of the house, we're going to have dinner at your house tonight. And so the owner of the house gives them this beautiful upper room. If you've been to Jerusalem, there's a traditional site for it. When I went, we went to a non-traditional site, but a site that could be a little bit more humble, sort of like the Shepherd's Cup in one of the in one of the Indiana Jones movies. You remember the humble Shepherd's Cup? Went to kind of a humble room that could have been the kind of location where this Last Supper would have taken place. And so the arrangements are made. They're reclining at the table. And then we pick up the action here. Well, I guess first we should say that the title of the message is How to Roll Like Jesus. How to Roll Like Jesus. And so in this text, we're going to look at this. Why did Jesus wash the feet of his disciples? That's the first thing we want to look at. So at John chapter 13, verse 1, it was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Notice it doesn't say it was time for him to die, because death is part of a journey. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. Or in some versions it might say something like, he loved them to the last. It doesn't say Jesus showed them the secret of success. Okay, I'm getting ready to go now, so I'm going to show you the secret of success. No, he says he showed them the full extent of his love. But that is the secret of success. So, as a matter of fact, he did show them the secret of success. He showed them the full extent of his love. That is how Jesus rolls. He shows people the full extent of his love. Loves them to the end. Verse 2, the evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. We talked about that. We don't know exactly how that was done. Verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing. This was the custom. And foot washing was a cultural practice, a normal cultural practice. People wore sandals. They might have taken a bath, but then when they walked someplace, their feet got dirty. And so it was a normal cultural custom to wash feet, to offer your guests a foot washing. Some of you might remember the story of Jesus going to Simon the Pharisee's house, and the woman comes in and she anoints his feet with her tears and wipes them, and Simon's all upset about that. And Jesus says, Simon, she's been forgiven much. It's because she sinned much. That's the way it works. Those who think they've sinned little, they're forgiven little. But those who realize they've sinned a lot, they're forgiven a lot. And she's had many sins, and her sins are forgiven. But Simon, I came into your house and you didn't even offer me water to wash my feet. So it was a type of hospitality that would have been given. And so when somebody would do a labor, they would take off their outer garment, their robe, which is what Jesus did here, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Verse 5, after that he poured the water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. So it was servants' work. It was servants' work. What's obvious in this passage is that Jesus was doing menial work. Menial work. What he's trying to communicate here is that my way, the way I roll, the way I do total global conquest, the starting point for all of this is sacrificial, loving service done in humility to one another. He's setting an example, as we'll see here in a moment. But first we have to do the Peter sidebar. So verse 6 through 11. So he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Okay, overreact left. Jesus answered, unless I wash your feet, you will have no part in me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Overreact right. Jesus answered, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem here is that Peter wants to tell Jesus how he needs to roll. Peter wants to dictate the terms of total global conquest to Jesus. Why? Zeal without knowledge. And that's why Jesus is giving this message over these next few chapters, is so that the zeal of the disciples, Jesus has fanned up our enthusiasm as his disciples through all these different feats and these different miracles and signs and wonders, all these things he's done. And we have seen him raise the dead. We've seen him heal the sick. We've seen him do all these things. And we're juiced up. We have zeal. But he wants to make sure they also have knowledge. Peter here, zeal without knowledge. It is not good to have zeal without knowledge. Proverbs 19:2. Reading on at verse 12. So when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master. Do you want to be a servant? No servant is greater than his master. Nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Do you want to be a messenger for God? No messenger is greater than one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. It says there, now you know. Now you know. Now you know how I roll. This is how I roll. This is how I make disciples. This is how I want you to roll. I'm giving you an example to follow. And so, what does washing feet look like today? Well, it could look like washing feet. There are many different denominations and religious groups that do ceremonial foot washing. And of course, that's perfectly all right. But of course, what Jesus is getting at here is something that's much more profound, much more part of the fabric of our life, the DNA. He's trying to change the DNA of us as his disciples. Because this was an example, but this was meant to be something that we would do routinely with other people. So here is the big idea for the day. Oh, and by the way, I mean, it's a metaphor, right? Washing feet is a metaphor. It's an actual thing he did, but it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for sacrifice. It's a metaphor for love. It's a metaphor for service, serving others. It's a metaphor for humility. So I decided to wash my neighbor's feet. So we live on a lake, and we had this scum, this fibrous algae, looked like a blanket. In fact, it was about like a wet blanket that was along our lake shore. So I went down, and I got a rake, and I scraped it all out, and your back is killing you. And then I noticed as soon as I got my lake done that my neighbor's lake now had it. Now, I wasn't just thinking that his might blow over on me, but I thought it would be a good idea. I thought it would be a good idea to show them the full extent of my love and to follow the example of Jesus. And so I scraped off all of this out. Well, they had more than I had. And so it took longer. And I keep waiting for somebody to come out, and say, thanks for doing that. Can I give you a little help? Nobody ever came. In fact, they weren't even home. They never even knew that this algae had been out on their lake. And so all these years I've had to live with the humble feeling of having served them and never getting any credit for it until now, when I thought I could use it in this illustration and get some credit for having helped them. So what is washing feet today? It's whatever you identify that needs to be done. Here's the big idea. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and do that. As a believer, so I talked to you about, when you meet a stranger, you might just think the question, I wonder if this person is an angel. When you meet anybody, and you're trying to figure out, how do I disciple them? Either by sharing my faith, or by equipping them in some way, or by serving them. This is one way of approaching that. What's the equivalent of washing feet with this particular person? So the big idea today: figure out the equivalent of washing feet and do that. Next. This is what I was going to use as the big idea, but I decided against it. So the idea is, somebody says, well, why did you do that? Why? Because I'm a Christian, and that's how we roll. But it just didn't seem very spiritual. So, all right. So what is the discipleship opportunity here in this text? There are a couple of things. The first is to become this kind of disciple ourselves. It's to become this kind of disciple. It is not good to have zeal without knowledge. And so it's to get the knowledge of God that he's presenting here, not only here, beginning here, but in these next few chapters that we'll be looking at as well. And it's to do everything in love. It's to avoid polemics. Jesus says, love your enemies. And so all the polemics, everybody's angry these days, or not everybody, but so many people are angry these days, and there's so many venues in social media for people to let other people know just how angry they are about things in general. And my dad used to scream at the TV, the evening news, and like he could, like I was going to change anything. Well, he didn't have social media, but I'm sure he'd have been on there just screaming and yelling about everything because he's so frustrated because of the way the world is going, because it's not turning out the way we thought it would. But Jesus would say, no, don't do that. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Don't be polemic. Proverbs 51, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 22:11, which is one of my life verses. He who loves a pure heart and whose speech is gracious will have the king for his friend. You want to have influence? Seek a pure heart. Let your speech be gracious. Avoid polemics, and you will have the king for your friend. So, the discipleship opportunity, first one is to become the kind of disciple that would follow this example that Jesus has laid down here. Somebody who would consider others as better than themselves, as it says in Philippians 2:13. Consider others as better than yourselves. Second opportunity for discipleship here is if the first opportunity is to become this kind of disciple, the second opportunity is for us to make these kind of disciples. It's for us to, as disciple makers, it's to spread this message. When we see people being mean-spirited, Christians being mean-spirited, Christians setting up a pecking order, which is the way of the world. How many of you have ever been around a chicken coop, around chickens? Any of you? Everybody's heard of the pecking order. Here's where it comes from. When I was in high school, I raised chickens for money. I never actually made any money, but that was the idea at the beginning, at least. And I had Rhode Island Reds, and I was going to sell the brown eggs because nobody else had brown eggs back then. And so I had this chicken coop, and I built it, and I had all these chickens. And sure enough, inside the coop, there was a pecking order. There was the head chicken, the head rooster, and he could peck on anybody he wanted to, and he did too. And then there were other chickens. There was a number 2 chicken, and the number 2 chicken could peck on any chicken except the number 1 chicken. And then the number 3 chicken. The number 3 chicken ran around and pecked on every chicken in the coop except the number 1 and the number 2. And then there was the last chicken. And all day long, this chicken, everybody could peck on him. And so you can imagine how happy the next to the last chicken was that there was a last chicken, so at least he had somebody to peck on. This poor last chicken had nobody to peck on. That's the way of the world. That's the way the world works. And Jesus said, no, you're going to crash here. You're going to crash. The way of my gospel is there are no pecking orders. It's not that Jesus is inverting social relationships. He's leveling them out. He's leveling out social relationships. And so when you were discipling disciples, you don't set yourself up as the teacher and then the other person as the student. You're the nodal. Jesus has already said, servant's not greater than his master, or messenger greater. And this is what he did. And so this is the example that he set up for us. We should follow. Well, there probably is a lot more that I could say about these 2 discipleship opportunities. But the question is, how do you want to roll? You want to roll like Jesus? If you want to roll like Jesus, then this is how you roll. Big idea today. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and do that. In your own discipleship, in making other disciples, figure out what is the equivalent of washing feet in every situation, and then do that. Oh, so easy. So, what are some ways we can follow the example of Jesus today? So, maybe you're a husband. Maybe you're a husband. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and do that. So what's the menial work that your wife is doing that you could do that would be an expression of the full extent of your love to her? So for me, it was learning to take out the trash, because for the first years of our marriage, she was the trash person. I believed it was a meaningful division of labor. It worked. But somehow, the marriage prayer and some other things changed that. Okay, so what are some ways you can follow the example of Jesus today? as a father. As a father. Did you know that there are a lot of men that have visited this Bible study, but they don't come to this Bible study because they drive their kids to school? They drive their children to school. Now, I think it's okay to take a day off and come to the Bible study, just saying. But they're doing this to show their spouse and their children the full extent of their love. And what they've done is they're figuring out the equivalent of washing feet for their kids, and then they're doing that. This is something menial, driving, doing carpooling. That's something menial. That's menial work. Their wife could do it, perhaps, or maybe a neighbor. But they figured out that this is for them. This is washing the feet of their kids, and they're doing that. Or maybe it's maybe a way that you could follow the example of Jesus' day is the way you drive your car. Well, like maybe coming out of church the way you drive your car. Now, this is not a message for me. This is a message for you. I'm the teacher here. Oh, pecking order, let's get that back in place. This is how you should live, not how I should live, okay? Let's get that straight. But I had the most unbelievable experience this week. My wife and I had been out to dinner, and we came up to an intersection just a couple of blocks from here, and there was a big black Mercedes in front of us getting ready to turn right onto 1792 off of a side street. And we were right behind them, and Patsy has a 12-year-old Honda Accord. And she loves it. You got to love a woman like that. Doesn't have to have a new car, right? Thank you, Jesus. So her 12-year-old Honda Accord would, this Mercedes, this big black Mercedes, the whole Honda would have fit in the trunk of this car. But anyway, there was this, and this car stopped and didn't need to stop. And I thought, why aren't they turning right? And I looked up, and this big honking black Mercedes had stopped because the driver had seen what looked like an indigent, probably just poor family that had started, a single-parent family that had started to walk across the street from the other side of the highway. And this car, even though it could have gone ahead, and made it easily, decided to stop and let these people cross that highway. Changed my life. Watching that changed my life. That's humility. That's showing people love. That's figuring out the equivalent of washing feet and then doing it. Not a big thing, but for the 3 or 4 or 5 of us who saw it, I think it made a lasting impression. Or maybe you're a salesman or a purchasing agent. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and then do that. Maybe you're a business owner. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and then do that. Maybe you are a repairman. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet. Maybe you're an elected official. Maybe you're a doctor. Maybe you're an educator. Maybe you're a first responder. Figure out the equivalent of washing feet and then do that. Maybe you're a policeman. God, I love policemen. So last weekend, I took my street car, I have a sports car, and I took it down to a track day at Sebring. So I spent the day on track at Sebring. And, Sebring is what I consider my home track. And every great track has greatness because there's at least one corner on the track where every time you go around, you hold your breath because you're not 100% sure it's going to work. And that's the definition of a great track. Sebring has 3 turns like that. Turn 1, the last turn, and then there's a turn called Bishop's Bend. And I got into racing originally because I sat in the bleachers at Bishop's Bend and watched Barry Ellis come around in a Porsche around Bishop's Bend, and it was so thrilling to watch this car go through this high-speed corner. So it's a double apex left-hander, and you come into it. You come out of the tower turn, and so you're going in my streetcar. You're probably going 90 to 95 miles an hour at the beginning of the turn, and then you begin the turn, and by the end of the turn, you come to the breaking point exactly at the point where you end the turn, and in my streetcar going 110 miles an hour. So going over 100 miles an hour through a left-hander. That to me it's heaven on earth. And so I left the track on Saturday, and the last thing the guy I was with said to me, he said, "Now remember, you're not on the track anymore." So, but I forgot, and so all the way from Sebring back to back to I-4 up 27, it's one little town after other, and they all have their own speed limits. And so next thing I know, and a sharp-looking young police officer comes up, and I said, "Did I just get busted?" He said, "Yeah, you just got busted, 66 and a 50. I said, "Oh." I was thinking, well, that's not so bad. And so, I mean, it could have been worse. He could have nailed me when I was going 80, so, you know. And so he went back. He said, "Got my license." He went back and he, made sure, weren't any outstanding warrants for murder or anything like that. And he came back and he showed me the full extent of his love. I wanted to say, "Oh, thank you for washing my feet." No, I didn't. I hadn't said the passage yet. But it was. He let me off. He let me off. But that was for him. You see. That was just figuring out the equivalent of washing somebody's feet and doing that thing. You don't have to be mean-spirited to everybody. You don't have to do the full extent of the thing. So this is the big idea for the day. And as you leave here today, if you want to be a disciple, if you want to make disciples, if you want to be involved in Jesus' plan for total global conquest, you don't have to go out. You don't have to go out and figure out how to balance the federal budget, although that'd be a good idea if you could do that. The thing that you need to do, and I need to do when we leave here, is we need to go out and follow the example of Jesus. And the example of Jesus today would be to figure out what the equivalent of washing feet would be, and then do that. Make sense? Let's do it. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for this powerful metaphor of washing feet that you have given us so that we might consider how we might figure out what the equivalent of that is in all of our encounters, in every situation, and then do that thing, Lord, that will change the world as people see how we love them as you have loved us, as we become messengers of your love, as we become servants of you, our Lord and Master. So, Lord, show each of us how we might respond to this passage today for your glory and for your praise. And we pray in the name of you, Jesus. Amen.